Think about what it would be like to be faced with death and offered a picture of life after this world ends. John, a mechanic and devout Christian, had that exact thought while he fished in the Brazos River one summer day. John saw Jesus Christ in a spiritual form when he was struggling for his life. Right then and there, he saw with his own eyes how God judges the souls of the dead. He saw the selflessness and bravery of those who had devoted their lives to serving others. John had direct experience with the rude and egotistical people who had put their own demands before those of others. Returning to earth as a mortal, John saw it as a second chance to live life to the fullest and aid those in need. This touching narrative recounts the life-altering events that transpired after John's near-death experience. During our summer vacation, my dad mentioned that he was planning to go fishing in the Brazos River. So that I could play in the water while he cast his line, I begged him to let me come along. After I persuaded 4 of our neighbors to join us, we all piled into Dad's car and drove to the river. As soon as we arrived, we hurried into the water, moving about 30 or 40 yards away from Dad's fishing spot. After we had played in the water for about an hour, my dad invited us to accompany him as he traveled upstream. In his absence, we began to wade upstream while he leisurely walked down the bank. There were only 5 kids my age who had never swum before, and I was one of them. About 5 yards behind the group was where I trailed. While we waded upstream, I tripped into a hole and tumbled through. The pace was so high that I couldn't even pause to collect my breath before collapsing. At one point, I began to choke on water as I struggled to the top. Upon reaching the surface, I started to spit water, but I was unable to pause for air before diving back under. After each of these battles, I felt like I couldn't breathe. I was also exhausted from the battle. I was so mad with myself for not breathing enough air as I writhed in the water, as I struggled to keep my head above water. I stopped trying because I was too exhausted to keep going. Everything seemed to be moving at a glacial pace, and I felt painfully slow as if I were in a movie or TV show. The fact that my limbs were moving so slowly made me understand how ineffective they were. Suddenly, I felt like I was floating above my physical form. As long as I could keep my eyes on my fighting body, I didn't mind being in 2 places at once. The truth is that I was unable to juggle being in 2 locations at once. It was my body that was down there, and I was up here. I was too far away to sense the water's pressure or the strain it was putting on my body. I kept going up until I was about 10 feet over the water, and then I paused and hovered. I was relieved that I hadn't gulped down too much water and was neither exhausted nor in discomfort from my earlier struggle below. Being above the water felt fantastic. I beheld a glowing disk about 20 feet away. It dangled just out of my sight, its brilliance staggering my senses. The object, which was around the size of a basketball, seemed to be engulfed in a whirlwind of light, resembling smoke in the sky, and it emitted very brilliant beams of light. Deep in the center of the light beam, there was a small pitch-black dot. That tiny dot captivated me for some reason. As it got closer, it became larger until it was as tall as I was. Then, as I watched it approach, Jesus stepped out of it and stood before me. Swiftly taking a protective stance with my hands, I gestured for him to cease harassing me. Being in his presence made me feel unworthy since he was a pure and spiritual man. The corruption of this material world tainted me, a mere mortal. His reach out to me washed away my feelings of guilt and worthlessness. Standing majestically before me, he radiated a golden light from all angles and had a luscious complexion. Even while human senses cannot discern such speed, just over 186,000 meters per second, I could perceive this glorious light emanating from him in all its splendor. What he exuded was an enchanting glow that words cannot express. Seeing this light gave me a spiritual boost and me the impression that it was recharging my batteries. From this light, Jesus' wisdom, love, and kindness seemed to emanate in all directions, penetrating my own soul. When I looked down at my body, it seemed as white as snow. With his beard and long hair, he stood before me, dressed exactly as he was 2,000 years ago, as we see him portrayed in art. I can't place the words he said when he spoke to me. "Do not be worried. Go to sleep," he emphasized. His voice was both commanding and beautiful. Being deaf has made it difficult for me to hear and talk since I was a little child. Both attending and doing well in class were challenges for me. Because of my hearing loss, I struggled to understand and participate in class discussions and to pass the assessments needed to advance to the next grade. However, when Jesus spoke to me, I heard him clearly and simply. In my perspective, his voice had a lovely melodic sound. When we conversed, neither of us could move our lips. It appears as though we were able to establish ESP communication. Along with my attempt to strike up a conversation with him, another strange thing happened. When he heard me, I still hadn't even uttered a word. As soon as I thought of something to say, he appeared to have the ability to read my mind. We kept talking in this way the whole time. Suddenly, a massive screen materialized before our very eyes. The enormous size of this screen evoked wistful thoughts of the bygone days of drive-in movie theaters. Being that close to it made the screen seem enormous. Countless scenes from my little time on Earth were being replayed on this screen. There were so many scenes playing out on that screen that it seemed as if my whole life were being recorded. Every scene came after the next in a completely random order, with no discernible link between them. The instant we die, all of our lives are reenacted in a haze, according to several accounts. It was exactly the same for me. After Jesus would point out a scene, it would enlarge until it almost filled the screen. There were other scenes beyond the now central setting of our conversation, but I could still make out a lot of activity within. While we were both fixated on the main picture, he started to question me about what had happened. He demanded answers about my sister's hair, the pebbles I threw at my dog, yanking my neighbor's cat's tail, and my deceitful behavior towards my mother. I deceived someone on more than one occasion during our time together. In some of the innumerable scenarios I observed, I found myself in the role of the bully, the insulter, or the one who delighted in destroying someone's clothing. He singled out every instance in which I had done something really nice or really terrible for myself. We went over each scene together, and I was asked to comment and explain what I did. In that moment, I was already aware that I was really messing up. Whenever I tried to provide a more subtle explanation to minimize the seriousness of my acts, he cut me off as I was telling what I did in each incident. He was quite complimentary if I performed something good in a scene. It was common for Jesus to burst into fits of laughter whenever anything funny happened. His sense of humor is second to none. When I add it all together, the number of scenes where I was successful is significantly smaller than the number where I was unsuccessful. I was certain that I was in a lot of trouble with him. A crushing fear of damnation had developed within me. Out of nowhere, the screen vanished. He extended his hand to grasp mine, and we began to swiftly descend into a tunnel. Like denser smoke billowing from an open fire, the entire tunnel seemed to be constantly churning. At high speeds on a road, even seemingly immobile objects like trees and power line poles seemed to vanish into thin air. Despite my complete lack of awareness regarding the tunnel's real motion, I got the distinct impression that it was rapidly pulling me along with its walls, ceiling, and floor. The only other word I can use to describe the walls, ceiling, or floor is the word firmament from Genesis. I felt the passing of time as I took in all this information about the tunnel. I could see a light far away when I looked forward. I suddenly realized, we're finally getting there, but I had already left by that time. My buddy reached out and delicately caressed my foot as we swam beneath me. As I sank under the water, I sensed my identity resurfacing. At that same moment, I was trying to reach the water's surface while gasping for air once again. While I was under, my swimming partner pulled me to the surface and continued on her way to the shore. To my palate, this was the most exquisite air I had ever tasted. As I struggled to catch my breath, he swam a little distance. Like everyone else, he seemed to be struggling. I put one leg over him and slid off into the water after realizing that if I continued to weigh him down, I would drown him. Gasping for air, he ascended. We both fought our way to the shore as my feet hit the riverbed, and then we both collapsed onto the bank. During the struggle, I ingested some river water, and now I'm throwing it up. I kept throwing up because I had consumed so much water that my stomach was about to burst. I started to dry heave again after vomiting water 10 or 15 times. All across my body, I was in searing agony. Due to the extended vomiting and heaving, as well as the strain on my stomach from consuming so much water, my muscles and stomach were exhausted from the struggle. For the next 2 weeks, I aged. After deciding we'd seen enough for the day, my dad took us home in the family car. Jesus and the tunnel were a blip on my memory. Over the subsequent days and weeks, my whole life seemed to flash before my eyes as I pondered the event. Until over 30 years later, that was all I could recall. A newspaper article I was reading about a person's near-death experience brought back some vague memories. It only took a little reflection for me to realize that I had developed post-traumatic stress disorder and was unable to remember the events because I was in such a state of shock at the time. After thinking about it for what felt like an eternity, the memory finally returned to me. You won't want to miss this next near-death experience. It's about a woman whose mind-bending tale is full of profound wisdom.